Good afternoon, everyone, or morning or evening, depending where you're from. Thank you so much for joining us today in this very important session. I'm Lois Bozzatta. I'm Head of Business Engagement and Impact at the Rights Lab, the University of Nottingham. In partnership with my colleagues at GoodWeave International, we are delighted to welcome such a diverse and engaged audience from around the world. We have a fantastic 900 registrants today, so your interest underscores here the significance of the issues we're addressing today. So just to let you know, here's how today's session will flow. After a brief introduction from myself, my colleagues will present the findings from our research report. Then we'll transition to a panel discussion featuring our distinguished guest speakers. And finally, we'll open up the floor for questions. We're looking forward to a thought-provoking discussion about Bangladesh, which stands at a pivotal moment, navigating overlapping political, economic, and labour market challenges. These challenges highlight the urgent need for coordinated action among stakeholders, from governments, private sector actors, and civil society, both locally and globally. Our hope is that our research will contribute to these critical conversations here at the OECD Forum, a key industry event focusing on due diligence in the garment sector, starting with today's session. On the international front, evolving standards like the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CS3D, forced labour bans in the US and EU are raising the bar for human rights due diligence. These developments are directly affecting large international buyers and indirectly their business partners, including those in Bangladesh's garment sector. We'd particularly like to highlight as well the voices of workers in this sector who are affected by us, whatever our roles, by the choices we make corporately, politically, and personally. This focus of collaboration was expressed by one of our focus group participants of the study, who said, "We need collective efforts to change our situation." We're very excited to share that we've just launched this research report titled "Modern Slavery and Child Labour in Bangladesh's Garment Sector, Documenting Risks and Informing Solutions." This report is the culmination of over 18 months of research on human rights risks in garment supply chains across 20 industrial clusters of Dhaka and Chattogram. You can find the link to download the report in the chat, which my colleague will share shortly. And we encourage you to submit your questions at any time during this session using the Zoom Q&A feature, please. And we'll address as many as possible during the Q&A portion at the end of the session. If you do encounter any technical issues during the session, please use the Zoom chat as well to reach out to our support team and they'll be happy to assist. This event is being recorded and we will share the recording with you after the session. Our colleagues at GoodWeave will also be attending the forum in Paris in person tomorrow, Wednesday, and will be in Dhaka directly after. So please do reach out if you want to connect with them. And again, my colleague will share our contact information. I'd now like to hand over to my colleagues to kick off the presentation of key findings from our research. So it's my dear pleasure to introduce you to Anastasia Kliucha, Rights Lab Research Fellow in Anti-Slavery Policy and Interventions at the University of Nottingham, and Dan Carlin from GoodWeave International's Senior Monitoring, Evaluation and Research and Learning Manager. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Lois. Good morning and afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm very pleased to present our research findings to you. This is the first time we are sharing them publicly, and it's great that such a knowledgeable audience is hearing them first. My name is Anastasia Kliucha. I'm part of the Rights Lab, University of Nottingham, and led this research working closely with my colleague Lois Bozzatta, the Bangladesh Labour Foundation, and GoodWeave, with additional consultation from the Avash Foundation. All of us are present here today, so once again, I'm glad to be sharing this research in such a wonderful setting. I'm going to talk a little bit about our research areas and tools, as well as key findings, and then my colleague Dan will provide you with more details on some of those findings. The main goal of this research was to document the existence of modern slavery and child labor practices within Bangladesh ready-made garment industry. Additionally, we focused on hidden and undocumented subcontracted units in energy sector, and we also aimed to explore the presence of home-based production in the sector. Our research had 4 main phases. We started with designing research instruments and going through ethical review. Ethical review and approval was conducted by the Research Ethics Committee at the University of Nottingham. Then we had a pilot stage from the middle of October to beginning of November 2023, where we tested our instruments and conducted some surveys so the team could identify and make any necessary changes. Then we had a main data collection period from December 2023 to July 2024 and included surveys and focus groups. And then at the final stage, we of course analyzed our data and prepared the final report, which we presenting to you today. For collecting data, we explored 2 divisions, data and Chattergram. Areas for data collection were selected based on presence of both export-oriented and subcontracted factories producing RMG for export, based on high population of RMG workers living in the areas, and of course, based on consultations with our research partners on known risk of labor abuses among the population. Altogether, the enumerator team spent 101 field working days and conducted 1,974 surveys with adult and minor RMG workers. In addition to the surveys, we also conducted 10 in-person focus groups with 88 RMG workers, including minors, 7 focus groups in Greater Dhaka, and 3 in Chattergram. For survey data collection, we had 2 questionnaires for RMG sector workers, one for adults and one for minors under 18. We confirmed that they were working in the RMG industry producing for export, observed or self-reported. And in all cases, we asked the consent of the participant, and for minors, we also asked for consent of their legal guardian. Talking about demographics of our research, the majority of survey respondents were female, representing 67% of all adult respondents and 83% of all minor respondents. This reflects the gendered nature of work in the RMG sector in Bangladesh, where females make up the majority of the labor force. 31% of adults worked in factories delivering partially or totally subcontracted work. For minors, 80% of them worked at such factories. And if talking about home-based production, 4% of all adult participants were performing home-based work, supplying bigger exporting factories, plus 1 minor. If talking about location and age, a higher proportion of minors in RMG worked in Chattergram than in Dhaka, potentially attributable to less extensive oversight of the sector in Chattergram. And now I want to move to our key findings before giving the floor to my colleague Dan. First of all, child labor is present in RMG export supply chains in Bangladesh, especially via subcontracted factories, and my colleague Dan will speak more to this in a moment. 32% of adult RMG workers surveyed are being paid below minimum wage, and 7% of respondents' income leaves them living below the international poverty line. Almost a third of factory workers report working more than 10 hours per day, 6 days per week, which exceeds the maximum limit for regular and overtime hours set by Bangladeshi law and international law, and it is an indicator of forced labor. Then we'll also speak more to this. While more women work in the RMG sector, they earn on average 2,000 taka, which is around $18 less per month than their male colleagues. Probably due to lack of oversight from the government and private sector actors, risks of various kinds, from child labor to underpayments, safety concerns, and abuse, were more common in subcontracted factories linked to export than in those with direct contracts with international buyers. 56% of factory workers surveyed have experienced threats or abuse at their current job. 68% of adult workers and 90% of minors who reported abuse were female. And in the end, home-based work is precarious, but workers surveyed feel safer from abuse when they work at home and appreciate flexible work hours. Thank you once again for your interest to our research. And now I would like to hand it over to my colleague Dan, who will share more data on some of our research findings. Dan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Anastasia. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. And the biggest thanks to Rights Lab and to Bangladesh Labor Foundation for the hard work, the long days, long nights to put out this terrific piece of research. I will cover a couple of the key findings and touch on the recommendations. First key finding is about child labor, and it helps to start with the law. So there are a few different components to child labor. There's children under age 14. They cannot do work of any kind at any time. 14 to 17-year-olds can work up to 36 hours a week, and that's inclusive of overtime. And then there are some restrictions on their work. So they cannot work between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m., and they cannot perform any tasks that are classified as hazardous. So applying these criteria, we found that 100% of the under 18 respondents were child laborers under Bangladeshi law. That first cohort, under age 14, that was 9% of our respondents. And then we found almost everyone was working more than that legal limit of 36 hours a week, and by quite a bit, as you can see in the graph on the right. So this bar on the far right shows that over half of the miners in Chattogram were working more than 12 hours per day. That's in a 6-day week. And then we also found significant percentages, well over 80%, I believe, who were working between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. Why do we see more severity in Chattogram? Anastasia mentioned about the subcontracting piece. So 80% of the child labor we found was at fully or partially subcontracted factories. So they are supplying the export market. They're doing some work and then moving the product on to the exporters. And we actually found a high prevalence of those factories in Chattogram. So if we look at the graph on the right here, we can see a third of those miners were working in fully subcontracted factories, and they were 5 times as likely as adults to be working at those factories. And then at the mixed factories that do some subcontracting and some exporting, miners were twice as likely as adults to work there. And then when you look at the export-oriented factories, you see a large disparity. Over 2/3 of adult workers are working at those export-oriented factories. For that first cohort of child laborers, the under 14-year-olds, only one of them was working at an export factory, and the remaining 10 were at subcontracting factories of some type. So large disparities there. Our teams collected excellent qualitative data throughout, and I have a couple of quotes on this slide that bring forward themes we heard throughout the focus group discussions, throughout we were weaved throughout some of the quantitative data. So a 14-year-old girl told us, "I regret leaving school, but I feel I don't have a choice." And we heard this from children of all ages throughout. And we can see it in this quantitative data point. 98% of the minor participants are fully out of school, 0 days per week, 0 hours per day. Second quote she gave us, "Management didn't verify my age or give me a contract of any kind." So that speaks to lacking age verification procedures. And then we also did hear about young people submitting false documentation to be hired as adults. And when factory management looks the other way on that and hires them as adults, the management can get around those restrictions on their employment that I highlighted earlier. That also opens the door to other forms of exploitation. So this list is not comprehensive, but we heard several instances of unpaid overtime, lack of medical care, lack of written contracts, and payment delays for the under 18 workers. And this quote on the right from a 12-year-old boy hits on a couple of those themes. He says, "Once while I was cutting threads, I accidentally cut my skin. They wrapped it with a dirty, torn cloth and sent me home. Later, I had to buy medicine with my own money. They deducted 1 day's salary." The last major theme on child labor, and Anastasia mentioned it already and showed this graphic, but it's quite poignant. It jumps out, is 37% of our sample of minors came from Chattogram. They couldn't be interviewed. We couldn't get access to them without first interviewing an adult RMG worker, but only 14% of the adults were in Chattogram. So there was something happening there. We spoke about subcontracting as one explanatory factor for that. There may be others that were beyond the scope of this research. In terms of excessive overtime, again, this is the law in Bangladesh. So for adults, they can work 8 hours a day. 2 additional hours of overtime in a 6-day work week gets us to 60 hours maximum work per week. So we asked adult workers, well, we asked all workers, how many hours per day are you working? And that's what's shown in this graph. A quick disclaimer, this is the number of hours they spend in the factory. So if we look at this graph and we look at 11 hours, we might consider that some of these are 10 hours worked and 1 hour break. And so if we look at the left 3 columns of this as working within the legal limit, we can see that the majority of workers are actually working within the legal limit of hours per day. The 3 columns on the right, however, show us over 30%, almost a third of workers at the subcontracted factories are doing 12 to 14-hour days. And that's quite a bit more severe than at the export level, which was only 13%, or at the mixed contract level, which was only 19%. So again, that's that differentiation in the subcontracted layer. We recognize that these overtime hours are very important to these workers. They are entitled to twice their regular rate of pay during these hours. And so many workers want and need the overtime. So we asked them, are you getting paid the overtime to which you are entitled? And that's what this next slide covers. The first column in this slide says higher pay rate for work beyond 8 hours. And again, we can see the majority of workers, about 2/3 at the subcontracted and export-oriented level, they are getting that higher pay for work beyond 8 hours, a little bit less at the mixed contract factories. But if we jump down to the bottom 2 rows here, which are a lower pay rate for work beyond 8 hours, or not paid at all for work beyond 8 hours, you can see again those subcontracted bars being longer. It's 19%, about 1 in 5 workers at the subcontracted factories are not only not receiving the higher pay, but they're not even receiving their regular rate of pay. And again, it dwarfs the percentages at the export-oriented and the mixed contract factories. Why is that? I have a couple of quotes on the right that get into some of the reasons behind that. An 18-year-old boy told us, they increase our targets according to their will. They do not consider our work capacity. They make us work 10 hours instead of 8 hours and cut our overtime payment. And I'll emphasize again that point, cut our overtime payment. So we had several stories of, particularly since the minimum wage was increased last year, that factory managers would increase the daily targets for a worker such that the worker cannot complete it in their standard 8-hour shift. And then they get told, you did not finish your target and you must stay longer to complete it. And then they are not given that overtime. And that may be some of what we're also seeing in this second bar here with the higher percentages, no difference in pay rate for work beyond 8 hours. And then the second quote sadly just speaks to a whole body of general exploitation of young workers. A 14-year-old girl told us, I usually start work at 7 a.m. and end at 10 p.m., so my days are long. I'm upset about the hours and do not have personal time for myself or my family. For this, I earn about 3,000 taka, $27 a month. That's about $1 a day. And for reference, the minimum wage is more than 4 times that. That minimum wage is based on a standard 8-hour workday. We can see from this quote that the girl is actually working 15 hours a day. I will finish with the recommendations. These speak to all of the content of the report, so beyond what Anastasia and I have presented today. But quickly, mapping supply chains fully to bring out particularly those subcontracted work sites. A sector-wide assessment of forced labor and child labor, enforcing payment of living wages and that overtime pay I just spoke about, ceasing abusive and discriminatory working conditions, ceasing child labor, and establishing effective grievance mechanisms for workers so that those issues they raise to us in this research can be brought into formal channels through which they can pursue resolution. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to the discussion and everyone's questions.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that. To Dan and Anastasia. We will get back to you in the Q&A. If anyone does have questions for either presenter, please share it in the Zoom Q&A function, and we'll return to those towards the end of the session. And thank you to those as well who are asking for the slides. Just a reminder that this session is being recorded and will be shared with all registrants in the coming days. And all the findings highlighted by my colleagues can be found in the report as well, which my colleague has shared a link to in the chat. But now I'm delighted to introduce our moderator for this session, Baroness Young. Baroness Lola Young, Hornsey OBE, is an author, actor, activist, university chancellor and member of the UK House of Lords. Through her parliamentary role, she often works on and promotes legislation to eliminate modern slavery and human rights violations in supply chains. She has chaired all-party parliamentary groups and multi-stakeholder roundtables on modern slavery and business and human rights. And when Lola was awarded the Sustainable Fashion Champion Award by Drapers in 2023 for her work promoting human rights in fashion supply chains, she noted that the Rana Plaza tragedy in Bangladesh gave new weight and urgency to her arguments for the UK's Modern Slavery Act, which she helped to shape and eventually pass in 2015. So, Baroness Young, thank you so much for being here, and I'll hand over to you now to introduce our panelists and kick off the discussion.
Thank you very much, Lois, and thank you for inviting me to participate this afternoon. And again, thanks to everybody for joining us for this important panel discussion. Today, as Lois has said, we have a distinguished group of experts who are going to share their insights on some of the most pressing issues facing Bangladesh's garment sector, including living wages, forced labour, child labour, and the role of industry stakeholders in driving positive change. So a very warm welcome to Mr. Masukur Sikdar, Joint Secretary, Labour and Law Branch at Bangladesh's Ministry of Labour and Employment. Currently, he's working on the amendment of the Bangladesh Labour Act, and his responsibilities include ensuring rights and obligations for workers and employers, implementing national action plan and on eliminating child labour, and taking the necessary steps for mitigating labour unrest, working on setting minimum wages for different sectors and collaborating with other stakeholders in the sector. Welcome. I also like to introduce Nazma Akhtar, who's the founder and executive director of Awaj Foundation and the president of Somilito Garments Shramik, excuse my pronunciation, my apologies, Shramik Federation, one of the largest union federations in Bangladesh, and co-chair of Asia Pacific Women's Committee of Industrial Global Union. Nazma has been fighting to improve workers' rights, especially women workers, in the garment sector in Bangladesh for over 32 years. Thank you very much for coming along this afternoon, Nazma. Ashraf Uddin, Bangladesh Labour Foundation Executive Director. Ashraf is a member of the National Child Labour Welfare Council, the NCLWF, in Bangladesh, and has more than 24 years of experience in leveraging innovation to address social challenges for a positive change, including working on child labour and gender-based violence in the garment sector. So welcome, Ashraf. And finally, Shamaruk Mohiuddin, again, apologies, director at the global consulting firm Cadmus Group, as well as director of social impact at University Press Limited and co-board chair at GoodWeave International. She is an expert in catalysing cross-sector partnerships for international development and equipping businesses to be drivers and advocates for inclusive and sustainable growth. Once again, I'd like to apologise for my mispronunciation. I hope you'll forgive me for that. Just to emphasise, we do have a limited amount of time, so I'm asked to be quite strict on the amount of time you spend responding to the questions. And so I will let you know when you have used up 2 minutes, and you'll then have half a minute to sum up what you want to say in response to these questions. I'm going to start with Shamarouk. Let's start with you to set out the context for our audience. So my question is, in light of recent political developments and their impact on worker protections, what progress or setbacks have you observed in efforts to foster responsible business conduct? And what does this mean for Bangladesh's trade relationships and reputation?
Thank you, Baroness Young, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to participate today. So I'll just start with a little bit of context about the garment industry in Bangladesh. You might be familiar with the impact of the industry in the economy, but just to kind of back up and give you some statistics around that, Bangladesh is the world's second largest exporter, second to China only, and contributes quite a bit to the world garment exports. It has some large trading partners like the US and the EU, but also is increasingly selling to other parts of the world as well. The industry makes up about 12% of the country's GDP, and most of the export earnings, around 81%. In terms of employment, there are about 4 million people working in the industry, with about 53% being women, and about 4,600 garment industries, and that may not include all the subcontractors that we were just speaking about. So there are challenges that remain in the labor issues, obviously, in spite of this industry being so significant in the country's economy. So we'll talk a little bit about where Bangladesh has made some improvements and where there are still gaps to be filled. And many of you know that Bangladesh has suffered some major industrial disasters. Aside from the child labor issues, there's been issues around factory safety. We all know about the Rana Plaza disaster that happened about 12 years ago, where more than 1,100 people died in that incident. So since then, a lot of progress has been made, because both the factory owners and the brands and other parties, labor unions and others, have worked together to address a lot of the safety gaps. So since that tragedy, about 200 global firms got together in a legally binding pact known as the Accord for Fire and Building Safety, and worked together to address some of the basic safety criteria. And that included massive safety inspection and remediation, and that addressed about 2.5 million workers in that process. And there may have been child workers also within those factories that were inspected, but at the time the focus was really on factory safety. Similarly, the US firms also got together in another pact called the Alliance for Bangladesh Worker Safety, and also did remediation programs during that time. And according to the Industrial Global Union, significant progress has been made in remediation, with 53,000 inspections done since that time of the tragedy. But a lot of challenges remain around child labor, as we mentioned, and subcontracted factories, but also around the long working hours, as well as issues around transportation, housing, and education for the workers as well. And that's increasingly becoming an issue as you have a growing urban center and workers also moving into these urban centers looking for work in this industry. And
Thank you.
Sorry?
I'm sorry, so sorry to cut you off. If you just could finish that sentence, and then I'm afraid we have to move on. Thank you.
Sure. This was going to say that has an impact on the trade relationships with Bangladesh and other partners, including the US, EU, although recently Bangladesh has started receiving duty-free treatment to China. But for both the US and EU, the labor issues are paramount. So there are significant challenges. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for that summary, and there will be an opportunity to respond to further questions as we move through the session this afternoon. I'd like now to move to you, Mr. Joint Secretary, to ask you, as global supply chains increasingly adopt mandatory due diligence frameworks, for example, CS3D from the EU, including on wages and worker engagement, what steps is your ministry taking to align its RMG, its ready-made garment sector, with those evolving standards whilst remaining competitive? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to take part in this gala events. So as you ask the questions, I would like to say that Bangladesh demonstrates several strengths that support human rights and environmental due diligence in line with frameworks like the corporate social sustainability due diligence. The government has already ratified 8 out of 10 fundamental ILO conventions and also the Party of Paris Agreement. The government is in the process of amending the labor law with amendments expected by March 2025. These reforms will simplify the union registration process, making it easier for workers to enjoy their freedom of association rights, both at the factory level and nationally. Recently, the government reformed the tripartite consultative councils, and decisions are being made through tripartite discussions. Bangladesh is also recognized as a strong business hub with transparency in local supply chains, and business associations are well aware of about the due diligence requirements, and they have their capacity to translate it into the reality. Additionally, the country benefits from a skilled and gender inclusive labor force. Social protection schemes such as employment injury schemes currently in piloting in the RMG sectors are taking place for example of high progress in workers' welfare. Recently, the government has taken the initiative to increase annual increment from 5% to 9% for adjusting the inflation rates. So we are also working with the RMG Sustainability Council, RSC, to ensure the safety and address both occupational safety and health and non-OSH related issues. The government is committed to eliminating all forms of child labor and has reformulated the National Child Labor Welfare Committee as well as the National Action Plan to combat child labor. Finally, I would like to conclude to inform you that government has recently established Labor Reforms Commission, and this distinguished commissions has working hard to provide necessary pragmatic and suggestions, recommendations. Based on those recommendations, government will determine how to implement these changes for ensuring the rights of the workers as well as the obligations of our employers, to ensure good practices, to ensure minimum international labor standards in their working place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Joint Secretary, and we really appreciate you sparing the time to let us know how you're keeping up with a very fast-moving legislative landscape. Now I want to move on to Ashraf. From your perspective, having worked on child labour for a number of years, including advising government on the Child Labour Action Plan, what steps do you believe are most critical for preventing child labour, particularly in subcontracted supply chains, while addressing the root causes like poverty and lack of access to education? Quite a complex question to respond to in 2.5 minutes there.
Thank you, Baroness Young. Thanks, everyone. I think we have made some progress over the years in Bangladesh, but there is still challenge remaining in informal and subcontracting sectors like apparel, leather, agriculture, and so on. To me, the primary focus should be we need to take both immediate interventions and long-term systematic changes. As I can mention some of them, the brand should be accountable, and they should improve their monitoring system for subcontracting tracking. And Department of Factory Inspections, they also need to increase their inspection system beyond formal factories like a small workshop, home-based unit, subcontracting factories, which is a bit lack nowadays. And we do not have that much social security system. So the child labor's family should be incentivized sorts of cash transfer or livelihood support or food assistance need to be provided for them. Apart from that, we need to focus on free and quality education, vocational training program for the dropout or for the ongoing children. We need to create the bridging program who already been having engaged in the working. So we need to bring them back to the schools. Supply chain transparency is also very important. As I mentioned, the buyer should be liable, they should be transparent, and they should ensure fair purchasing practice and living wages for the workers. And suppliers' engagement should be more important throughout their supply chain in downstream levels. And I think union can also play a good role. A tripartite mechanism or meaningful stakeholders dialogue can actually block this child labor in upcoming days. We also need international collaboration and for sustainable solutions. Because this is a global problem. This is not only country problem. So we need to take action for government and multinational corporations for ethical sourcings. And through poverty and lack of education and weak enforcement, if we can actually break this cycle, we can actually take these child labor issues moving forward to the next steps. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashraf, for addressing that very complex question. I'm going to move now to Nazma. We've heard about poverty being a root cause of worker exploitation and child labour, and this is linked to low wages. In your experience, what are the biggest barriers to ensuring living wages for garment workers in Bangladesh? And how are trade unions ensuring that workers' voices are heard at the negotiation table beyond major exporting factories in lower tiers of the supply chain?
Thank you, GoodWeave and that to invited me in. And good afternoon from Paris and OECD conference here. Actually, if I'm going to root cause about the child labor using in my country and rest of the, especially in South Asia, because we don't have the national minimum wage structure. When the people are coming to our country due to the cheap labor, where is no respect, there is no dignity. And when the people are not getting the sufficient wage and payment, and the husband and wife were working, it's not sufficient, because in Bangladesh, if I'm going to talk about the ready-made garments, less than $100, but how much is the inflation? That is also the question. And that's why they have no alternate to do anything, and they must send their children to work. As a woman trade unionist and activist, the sexual harassment, abuse, and the low-grade employment as a woman, that is also one of the big problems. The whole supply chain is not transparent. There is no accountability. The UK government, I know you are from there, how they are coming to our country to colonialize, neoliberalization, militarization, all aspects are hazardous work are mostly doing by the women and the children. And the malnutrition, the maternity protection, the wages, there is no structure, informal economy. Although our law said that if the workers are 14 years, they have to work 5 years, 5 and 3 hours, get the education and something. No, they work more than 12 hours. They work 7 days a week. So this systemic change, the power should be distribute the brand to supplier, supplier to workers. We need independent union. The politician has to make committed, and also the lawmaker and legislation need to be changed. I know in Bangladesh going to be reform, and the joint secretary with us, we are going to change the law, and a lot of things are going to amendment. I hope the informal economy must be respectful, and everything has to be covered under the law, which is not. So the hunger, the nutrition, How do you think about the education and the health and housing? Because we are poor, we are hunger. So those kind of thing, and especially gender segregation and gender issues is more important. The union must be not only social dialogue, they have to be on table and do the proper collective bargaining agreement where we can change, because people are talking about the minimum wage. That's not the solution. We need to be living wage, better working condition, and especially the better living condition, how the one person can earn to survive 4 people. That kind of system and that kind of mechanism, all aspect, my government, your government, my policymaker, your policymaker, the union, and the workers, and the entrepreneur has to be respectful. And the purchasing practice is very important. Fair price is important, and respect the female who change the world, who make the economical strong in Europe as well as the America. We need justice and we need respectful workplace. Thank you.
I'm sorry to interrupt you there, Nazmel. Thank you very much for that. And timely reminder as well that we all have a part to play in our different ways, and legislation is certainly a part of that. So thank you for that. I'm going to go back to Mr. Joint Secretary, and I wonder how is the Ministry of Labour and Employment collaborating with international buyers and stakeholders like AWAJ and BLF to improve labour rights and eliminate child labour, for example, through supporting educational initiatives? Thank you.
Thank you very much for pertinent questions. Actually, government part, we are coordinating with our development partners, with our brand and buyers, and as well as with the BLF and other esteemed organizations, those who are involved with elimination of child labor in Bangladesh. We do have our action plan. In line with that action plan, already we have declared many factories and sectors free of child labor. And we are trying to eliminate this in line with that action plan. Since due diligence framework offers numerous opportunities for Bangladesh, compliance can attract foreign direct investment and boost the country's GDP. In that case, ethical business practices can enhance brand reputation and open new market opportunities. For the workers, compliance will promote fair wages, living wages, and gender equality. So far, we could believe. And it will also basis of the strengthen collective bargaining and freedom of association, also improve the workplace conditions, aligning labor laws with international standards as we are committed. So we are always in contact with the EU, European Union, ILO roadmap, and BLF USTR 11 points. Based on all these action plans and other commitments committed by our government to the GB of ILO, we are collaborating to make a significant and pragmatic and doable progress. And my government is committed to eliminate child labor. Especially, we have declared 43 hazardous areas where it is strictly prohibited to take child labor or appoint child labor over there. And as I told earlier in my submissions, that incumbent government has given a unique task to the Labor Reforms Commission to find out, to identify all the loopholes, all the necessary recommendations in consultation with our brands buyers, those who are the main forces of placing their orders to our entrepreneurs, and to ensure the workers' benefits and others, as we are discussing. And as we have heard from the study, that I think this study has explored the child labor presence in the subcontracting factories, as Mr. BFCD, Mr. Ashraf told that it is also the onerous duty of our buyers and brand owners to ensure the fair prices of our exporters. In that case, it could be easily addressed. What would be the justifiable rights, ensuring rights of our workers and the other privileges and benefits available under BLA. And we are trying to address more issues in coming law amendments. Maybe hopefully by March, we could be able to formulate that. Tomorrow we will have a TCC meeting headed by our honorable advisor. And this TCC Tripartite Council has been represented from government part, workers groups, and the employers federation. So based on this social dialogue, ensuring these dialogues, we are trying to incorporate and implement the wishes or the whatever may be the rights and obligation be ensured at a maximum level. We are trying our best. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Joint Secretary. And much of what you said does relate to efforts in the UK to get our government to adopt due diligence legislation. So it's very encouraging for me, at least, to hear what you're doing and how that fits in with other things that need to be done in this country. So thank you for that. So I'm going to go back to Ashraf. And just to say that one of the issues that actually, I beg your pardon. Yeah, okay, I've actually gone out slightly out of order. So I'm going to go to Ashraf first, then I'm going to come back to Nazma. So Ashraf, one of the issues that Bangladesh is grappling with is high unemployment and adolescents who are above the mandatory school age, with the majority of child labourers in the research study that we've heard about. So what examples have you seen of effective programmes to support this specific age group, that is 14 to 17-year-olds in Bangladesh?
Yes, you are correctly mentioned. This group of aged 14 to 17, they are actually highly vulnerable. They are actually trapped themselves in between the education, unemployment, and hazardous labor. And you mentioned that, you know, from the research, we have been found the same things. And, you know, most of them actually leave the school because of poverty, lack of vocational opportunities, and need to support their families. So, and the law says that they cannot engage in the hazardous job, but they are ending up with the hazardous job like RMGs, leather, shipbreaking, construction, informal works, and anything. But we have seen some bits of pieces, not a concrete, what is called result-based program yet. Like there is some programs from on skill development, like, you know, technical and vocational education training by USAPs and other groups. In safe and regulated environments, they actually provide educations to these adolescents workers. But the program is very limited and it's not very accessible. And I have seen some apprenticeship program from some employers, but this is also very limited. And you know, but the government has taken some programs over the years, like, you know, education, non-formal education, and skill development program. But it still is the quantity of child laborers we have in country. The program we have taken is actually not matching with each other's. So that is another challenges we are facing. And there are some bridging program from the civil society organizations. But again, compared to all these, compared to the volume of the child laborers, this is very poor. And again, I need to mention that there are some social protection and economic support from different government agencies, but it's very much politicized over the years. So we hope from interim governments, these periods, that maybe it can be changed, then that the child labor family can be adapted on these things, And this way we can actually provide some facilities to the children's family. So this is the some examples we from the Bangladesh point of view we have been taken, but there is a holistic approach needs to be taken care of. As I mentioned earlier, that brands and suppliers should take the responsibilities throughout their supply chains. When we are talking about the HIDD and CSD, we need to take care of our upstreams and downstreams, not only for the middle streams or only the tier 1 supplying factories. So by this way, maybe we can actually eliminate all forms of child labor from Bangladesh. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashraf, and pointing out another big challenge for us all there, because it's really important, obviously, for that cohort not to get neglected and for their welfare to be the primary consideration alongside their education. So thank you very much for that. So Nazma, I'd like to speak to you about women. So the study highlights that women from the majority of workers in the sector, women are the majority of workers in the sector, but are paid less than the men, occupy fewer leadership positions, and face higher levels of violence. What specific steps do you think are necessary to ensure gender equity, empowerment in the sector, and address abuse in the workplace?
I'm sorry to say, and don't take other way, because over 600 people are listening us, because the women leadership and empowerment is very important. This sector and the informal economic, mostly women. But if you come to the union perspective or negotiation, any dialogue, it's a male-dominating society, and male-dominating union is not much focused about the women's health and women's wages and other benefits. So we need those kind of leadership. Also, the women are working on the lower grade job. They need technically sound, and they need also leadership at the floor level management also. And also, the big problem, we need daycare center and crash. As per law in Bangladesh, if you have more than 40 women are working in the factory, there must be adequate crash system. But here, only they do for the buyer requirement or auditing. So very little percent, maybe 10 to 12 children are living in the factory, and rest of the workers, after 2 months, they go to countryside and breastfeeding rights, all aspect. Otherwise, many cases, if there is no family member in the countryside, they need to leave the job. All skilled women are leave. So that's why sometimes they send their children to work if they have 2 or 3 children. So these kind of things and this legislation has to be covered. Like in Bangladesh, we don't have the sexual harassment abuse law. We don't have those kind of things. So, this, we are really wanted to empower. We need leadership, and we need equal pay, equal wage, and equal job opportunities, and also how to make play better their children's quality education and quality things, because it's everybody's responsibility, because the first is a responsibility to government to monitor and evaluation and implement the law. If there is no law, there should be informal economy, need to be alignment with the country law, and also the all workers should be treated equally, because in our constitution 111, everyone should be get the equal wages and equal pay, but it is not happen. So that's why our constitution, our law has to be followed, and corruption should not be, because I can say one example, the tier 1 factory, the subcontract to subcontract, very low grade. She was like 12 or 13 years old, and she was working in the factory. She looks pretty. That is also the problem. And the owner was frequently rape her. Suddenly she was conceived, the 12 or 13 years old girl. And her mother is my member in our union, and came to me and said, we want remedy and justice. We took her in the police station, and he's arrested. But the justice, what they got? the man should get the married to her, and the father, the children should get the father identified. That's the solution. But we don't want to do that. The 12 years or 13 years girl should be raped and in the informal economy and the subcontract. You know, we are exporting most of the product rest of the world, but it's shame when the girls are abused like this. So education, training, and leadership, and the women's power and boys, and there have to be no fear, and there is no scare the man society and the other militarization, capitalization, and neoliberalization. Each and every product should be not like Rana Plaza, blood and sweat. That might be stopped, but when the people are raped and harassed, maternity protection, the daycare center, all when there is a lack of opportunities and less opportunities, that is very scary, and that need to be done, all parties, because I'm not going to say the brand responsibility is only, I'm not going to say that is the manufacturer responsibility, is not only it's all player, including the politician and also other stakeholder. Not anti-patriotism is very important. And if the woman can save, because now in Bangladesh, the women's labor force are increasing day by day. That is, and also inflation is too high. Sometimes our daily expense is higher than expensive in UK also. So, you know, so double burdens, double things, and they are mental depression and frustration are increasing. So mental health need to be controlling, and that kind of initiative need to be done legislation way, education way, and also emergency support. So it's I cannot, sorry, I'm going to 1 minute. It's not, I'm going to say that short term, mid term, but wherever need work, immediate action is important. Thank you so much, madam.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I appreciate all of those huge issues and challenges that you're trying to address, but in some respects it's relatively simple, which is gender equity has to be at the heart of any move forward, any progress that's going to be made in the sector. So thank you very much for that, Nazma. Then just finally, just a quick word, a final word for you, Shamaruk, before we move to the Q&A. As Bangladesh continues to evolve as a key player in global trade, especially in the ready-made garment sector, what is your vision for its future in terms of competitiveness and social sustainability? And what steps should be prioritized to ensure long-term growth and global leadership in this sector? If you can sum up your response to all of that in a couple of minutes, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we're at a unique juncture in Bangladesh where there is a lot of freedom of speech and people are able to express opinions about what's really happening inside factories and some of these violations, because we did go through a period of authoritarianism when a lot of crackdown happened on labor unions and other groups that were kind of expressing opinions freely. So I think we should use that time to strengthen institutions, and without strengthening institutions in a comprehensive way, not looking at just the labor issues, but broadly, like issues around gender, child marriage, education. Institutional reform would be a key factor in all of this, and I think that's kind of the goal of this interim government, but it has to be done well. And really focusing on transparency, as Nazma was saying. So that includes, I think, a regular review of the annual minimum wage and working hours, and having a transparent conversation with all of the stakeholders, including employers and the government and the workers. And of course, prioritizing these tripartite discussions as part of bringing the labor law into line with international labor standards. And I think that the independence of labor unions would be very important. So depoliticizing them and making sure that they're independently able to work and also recruit workers who are able to engage constructively in them. And I'll also point out that Bangladesh is graduating from the LDC status at some point in a few years. So that has implications for trade. And so Bangladesh has to address a number of these issues over the next few years to stay competitive as a trading partner and as a developing country trading partner. So I think there is a window of opportunity here, and I think that brands and international organizations and others can come together to address all of these issues together with this government and hopefully the next elected government as well.
Thank you so much. And it's really important, as you say, to recognise when these windows of opportunities come along to take advantage of them, because one can say that actually we've been in this state of trying to address these huge challenges and issues for too long, and that we need to make much more progress, much more quickly in terms of how we're going to ensure that we don't have to keep returning to these same subjects year after year. Anyway, I've now got some questions that have been submitted by our hundreds, literally, of visitors to this session this afternoon. So I'm really pleased to go through some. I'm going to ask the first question is, question one is, I would be interested in the panelists' perspectives on how we can scale action to address child labour in lower tiers where transparency can be lacking but risks can be greater. Who on the panel would like to have a crack at that question? Anybody want to have a go at that? It's about not just taking local action, but scaling that up in order to make more progress, particularly in lower tiers where transparency can be lacking, but risks also are greater because there's less of an eye on what's going on there. Would anybody of the panelists like to jump in on that question?
Yeah, maybe I can jump in. I think,
please do.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. The problem remains, we do not have a central monitoring system when we are actually talking about the elimination of child labor or protection of child labors. So we do not have national monitoring system yet. So that is one issue that we are not recognizing the bottom tiers or any layers of child labors. But apart from that, we must acknowledge that there is an existence of child labor, whether it is in lower levels, downstream level and upstream level, or backward linkages level. The acknowledgement is not a crime, but acknowledging something, maybe you can actually take action for remediations and all these things. So it should be a holistic approach. We first need to acknowledge that there is an existence of child labor in our supply chains. Then only actually we can scale it up to the next levels. Otherwise, if we actually argue or if we actually bargain with each other that we do not have child labor here and there, so I think we cannot actually, we are actually taking all this moving forward. So this is for me, for scaling up a holistic approach, shorter and broader strategic plan, and also the monitoring system needs to be enriched. And also Department of Inspection, their inspection system should be digitalized and formalized for the lower tier and also in the informal sectors.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that. Did anybody else want to make a quick response to that question? I do have others.
Yeah.
Nazma, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, because it's not only the education also. I think we need more vocational training and skill, because we are not fighting only for the employers or employees, because we are also fighting with the artificial intellectual. And that also came out in our reality. And because used to we are fighting for maternity protection, the wage and payment, but now our job is not secure. So these kind of things. And another issue, we need the social protection system, and we need the social scheme also, because if we really want to change the society and we really want to make better child rights and being a child workers, the social protection is the key issues that has to focus. And also we need safety and security and hazardous work and risks and hazardous work, how to mitigate. Because if you are going to if I'm going to the garment sector, it might be leverage and privilege for us. But when we go to the ironing factory, the ceramic factory, glass factory, or motorbike, so many sectors and also the informal economic, the home-based workers, those are very hazardous and things. But we are exporting so expensive good to Europe, America, but our people couldn't get the piece rate, precarious work, that contractual work. Those kind of system has to be changed, and artificial intellectual is problem. And Bangladesh is vulnerable for the climate crisis, economical crisis, as well as the politics crisis. So the purchasing practice, as well as the power and systemic change has to be shifted. Not only power should be the European, American country, it should be also Bangladesh, and trade unions should be independently raise their demand, and through negotiation, we need this kind of things. Thank you so much, Madam.
I'm sorry to interrupt you again, Nazmal, because obviously these are huge questions that we're trying to address here. And I absolutely appreciate that everybody's got something to say. I'm going to move on to the next question because I realise that we don't have very much longer for this particular segment of the session this afternoon. And this is a question for Dan or Anastasia. Does GoodWeave or Rights Lab plan to follow up and continue this type of research? And if you can give a relatively succinct response to that, then I can fit in another question. Thank you.
I think I can answer that one pretty quickly. Yes, we have interest, certainly. It wouldn't be exactly the same research study. Again, this wasn't a benchmarking study or a baseline study, but as mentioned in my presentation, certainly understanding that glut of child laborers appears to be in Chattogram. There are certainly more avenues we can explore there in Chattogram. We also, as you'll see in the report, even though heat stress was not specifically part of this research, there were quite a few findings on the effect of heat stress, climate change on workers. So that's another avenue we would be interested to explore. Nothing is slated right now, but we certainly do have the interest.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for answering so concisely. So I've got room for just one more question for the panelists. Can anyone comment on the supplier's responsibility or their accountability to pay fair wages? We hear a lot about brands' responsibility, but what about the suppliers? And perhaps I'll come to Shamaruk, and then perhaps Mr. Joint Secretary would care to respond to this. But can I start with you, Shamaruk? Would you like to respond to this?
Sure, I'll briefly chime in. So I think the suppliers should be absolutely responsible too. It's a two-way street, and the Bangladesh Garment Manufacturers and Exporters Association, BGMEA, and BKMEA and others should be engaged in the process. I do think that brands can exert significant pressure on suppliers when they're reticent about, moving forward on a lot of these issues. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the power of brands in putting pressure. And I've seen that in other countries like Sri Lanka, there have been sort of constructive engagement of suppliers by the government as well. So I think that we can maybe take some examples from the region.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Mr. Joint Secretary, have you got any final remarks you'd like to make?
Thank you very much. Actually, I have been enriched here from these invaluable discussions, and we do appreciate the research. And since they have focused on our subcontracting issues, and what Ashraf recognized, that we do acknowledge whatever may be the findings of the research. But in future, it would be appreciated if you could have a focused group discussion with the employers, brands, buyers, as well as government parts, those who are the key people of having had a constructive social dialogue. So if you do address all concerns, then your findings would be much more realistic, pragmatic, and based on those recommendations, I do appreciate your recommendations, and that would be the cornerstone to move forward in advancing or amending or reflecting those issues in our day-to-day business as well as in reforming the laws, because it is a continuous process. For having had these sort of invaluable comments, maybe we can share these experiences with the wider audiences in Bangladesh. Here we have found comprehensive audiences globally, but I do suggest to share this in Bangladesh physically. You can convene with the assistance of BLF or ILO or GoodWeave, that we can discuss or disseminate this information to the relevant stakeholders, so that they could be sensitized, they could be aware their rights and responsibilities, and that could be much better understanding to address all the concerns and have, to perform better than now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and very apposite words to conclude this part of the session. And thanks to all of our panelists for their generosity and their insight, and for sparing us the time to give us the benefit of their expertise. Thank you very much. I'm now going to hand the floor back to Lois to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Lola, and thank you again to all of the panelists. Yeah, I'll just briefly recap a couple of points shared by our speakers today, and wrap up for us all. And thank you firstly to Anastasia and Dan, who outlined our research findings, highlighting the experiences of workers, particularly in Bangladesh's garment sector. And we hope you will all read the report, which my colleague will share in the chat, and see the further detail that we've been preparing for you. Mr. Joint Secretary, we look forward to the labour law amends due later this year, which you've highlighted, and definitely echo what you're saying about working together across stakeholders to improve conditions for workers, from social protections through to business engagement. This is a continuous process, and I think your final point there was a really great summary of that, and our recommendations in the report as well. We've heard about the value of social dialogue with worker groups to make these developments meaningful and impactful. Our colleagues here today have also highlighted about increasing factory inspections, particularly at that subcontracting level, calling for social protection, vocational training and education for workers, both young and old, and recognising that supporting children's families would, including the living wage for RMG workers, would help protect young workers from having to leave education too soon. Our colleague also highlighted comments around distribution of power and the encouragement of trade unions and worker organisation mechanisms, the importance of women in leadership roles, from factory management to representing in themselves in committees, as a really important way of making sure that the workers, which are predominantly female, are being heard at all levels. And finally, also commenting as well on the transparency among stakeholders and encouraging tripartite collaboration, which balances and enhances these solutions. And thank you for Shamaruk as well, who highlighted the power of brands speaking up and playing the role that they have in improving these conditions. As a final reminder, please be sure to download our report, available via the link shared in the chat. Additionally, please feel free to reach out to GoodWeave or us at the Rights Lab if you have any questions, and hopefully again my colleague will share that information in the chat available to you. Our colleagues at GoodWeave will be attending the OECD Forum in Paris, and I think Nazma is already there, she mentioned, both tomorrow and Wednesday, and we'll be in Dhaka, Bangladesh later this week from the 15th to the 18th of February. So I think our colleagues have also invited a connection there if you would like to further engage on that. So whether you are in Paris, in Dhaka, or prefer to connect virtually, please don't hesitate to reach out on any of the questions or details that come through from today. We look forward to continuing this conversation. And on behalf of the Rights Lab and GoodWeave International, I'd like to thank you all again for attending today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the forum. Goodbye.